this episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We are sponsored by a number of very interesting organizations. Why? Because we are the location where all the activists and entrepreneurs that are disrupting this world are coming together to try to figure out how to make it a better place. What's great for everyone that can't attend today is these are all recorded and archived. This is the link you can use to register for future ones. You'll get a notice every week. Otherwise, you want to come to any of these key channels. These particular bit.ly links are case sensitive, so you'll want to kind of look at them accordingly. One of the things that we're going to be able to do is have several sponsors we want to present to you. Here's one of the really important ones we've found because it's becoming a very important area. We've just recently learned that hemp and probably marijuana, therefore, is coming off Schedule 1 after the first of the year. And so it's going to open up the market pretty dramatically. This, as it turns out, as we've discovered, is the only bioactive product on the market. We had the luxury of interviewing the inventor. And as a consequence, we really like this program. So they're giving special discounts to people of our organization that may happen to get up on here and participate. Just to give you a little flavor here, this is the site I was referring to. So this is a brand new entity we've got going. There's a variety of stuff in here. As a simple example, we're trying to monitor all the various organizations that are out there fighting for freedom for all of us. And so we're going to be doing a lot of reporting on all sorts of different things that are afoot. We've also had some great stuff. Here's the guy where we interviewed the inventor of that product. This is where we're very importantly, and the main reason I wanted to show everybody this is where we're going to allow these conversations to live onward. Because sadly, historically, we've had these great events. We've built up to them. We've made great relationships with the person who's the speaker. We record it, and then it kind of just lives in the afterlife. But we don't want it to stop there. We want to continue the conversation. A lot of people have questions. We have to end the show, and they still have questions they want to continue forward. So we're going to have this venue where they're going to be able to do that. You can click and listen to last week's guests. You'll see all of who's coming up. And then there's going to be ways, and here's the links to be able to look at those other ones as well. And then also you'll be seeing ways to start to communicate with our speakers on an ongoing basis. And we're going to continue to help them blog and post and keep this important topic that everybody's bringing to us moving forward. Here's an example where the stuff is archived. So you'll see there's a wealth of videos that go back for years and years, and you're certainly going to want to come through and take a look at all of these ones. There's some great ones, and some of the ones that are months old seem like we made them yesterday. Here's another one about 5G, speaking about that for tonight too. So we got a lot going on. This is our core sponsor, as I said. And on that note, let's shift gears and talk about today. So let's get over here and let's have Charles do the honors.
Sure, Jeff, and welcome, Matt. Matthew Mitchell is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, which dives into the weeds of regulatory policy and their impact on the regulated corporations in their markets. And they do great detailed work, not so much high-level policy, but the details of the impacts of these policies. He is a blogger at several venues that he can mention if he wants, and he also has several books that Jeff can show on that slide again if he wants. But the topic of tonight is the idea that if there are several hundred pieces of red tape from the bureaucracies that have been canceled or amended in some way to allow, for example, doctors from out of state to get reciprocal licensing to come in and help out in hotspots, or easing up on the certificate of need protectionism hospitals have to keep out competitors. If these regulations have gotten in the way of the COVID response, maybe they should be just gotten rid of permanently. And wouldn't entrepreneurs do really well if that were the case? In other words, should the temporary COVID deregulations become permanent? So, Matt, that is our intro.
All right. Well, thank you all. It's an honor to have the opportunity to chat with you today. What I want to address here is give you a quick summary of a paper that I've just co-authored with my colleagues, Patrick McLaughlin and Adam Thier. And as it says there, the basic idea is how do we address these regulations that have been suspended during the coronavirus? So one of the things that's interesting, of course, about the coronavirus is that while all of us are acutely aware of the power of the state, especially as we've been ordered to stay in our houses, There also have been these remarkable instances of the state receding in certain areas. So if you look all around the country, you see executive orders from agencies, from governors, from the President of the United States, easing, suspending regulations. These touch everything from local ordinances that dictate or limit the ability of people to run businesses out of their homes, to very important barriers to entry in healthcare that limit the ability of hospitals to open or expand. Certificate of need laws, something that I've studied quite a bit, near and dear to that research is near and dear to my heart. There are a lot of these things have been eased or suspended in order to make it easier for healthcare workers to fight COVID, and also for the rest of us just to deal with the situation. So for example, a lot of states have eased home delivery of alcohol, something that's been pretty handy for many of us. And so the question arises, what do you do after COVID disappears, or at least eases a bit, with these 600 plus regulations that have been waived or eased somehow to fight COVID? And so what to kind of take a step back, I think it's first helpful to start with where exactly we got here in the first place. So the overwhelming fact of regulation is that it accumulates over time. So this is my colleague, Patrick McLaughlin. He's standing next to the Federal Code of Regulations. Patrick is about 6'2", and yet clearly the Code of Federal Regulations towers over him. This code could have been read by, assuming that you read essentially every minute of every day. It could have been read in 1 year and 65 days and 22 hours back in 1970. And today it takes over 3 years and 117 days in order to read the Code of Federal Regulations. This steady accumulation has meant that at this point, there are now over 1 million restrictions in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's 1 million shalls, musts, may nots in federal regulatory code that limit the ability of Americans to go about their lives. So this the accumulation of restrictions is not just annoying and cumbersome, it actually has real economic costs. Some of my colleagues have explored that recently, and basically being able to compare empirically more regulated industries to less regulated industries. They are able to calculate the economic cost associated with regulation, and they estimate that regulations impose a cost of about 0.8% on GDP growth per year. Well, what does that mean in terms of our lives? Here's actual GDP growth from 1980 onward. Now the yellow line is potential GDP. This shows what our potential GDP growth would be if we had kept regulations at 1980 levels from then on, if we hadn't seen the steady accumulation from then on. So to put this in a per person perspective, this amounts to a $13,000 cost per person per year on our cost of living. So regulations aren't just cumbersome, they actually affect our standard of living. This is to say nothing of state regulations. All across the states, there is a regulatory burden that is in addition to the federal burden. So in California alone, for example, there's hundreds of thousands of restrictions in the federal or in the state code. So one of the problems about this is that regulations, while the public often perceives regulations as protecting the health and safety of consumers, in reality, they often really only protect the profits of the special interests that lobby for them. So economists have understood this for quite a while. George Stigler, the late Nobel laureate, famously wrote in 1971 that as a rule, regulation is acquired by industry and is designed and operated for its benefit. What's less understood is that many consumer advocates on the left have also understood this for quite a while. Often their insights get lost, but back in 1974, Ralph Nader and Mark Green wrote that the verdict is nearly unanimous, that economic regulation over rates, entry, mergers, and technology has been anti-competitive and wasteful. Moreover, they went on, our unguided regulatory system undermines competition and it entrenches monopoly at the public's interest, or at the public's expense. So since that research, there have now been dozens and dozens of case studies by economists looking at everything from railroads and trucking and airlines to hair braiding to radio regulations, to taxis, to teeth whitening, to optometry, to hospitals and sanitation. All over and over and over again, it's been shown that regulations quite often serve to serve the special interests and not the public. And they do this in a number of ways. They can do it by limiting competition, acting as a barrier to entry, raising the costs of rivals, compelling consumers to buy their products, locking in technologies. So if you are in business, unfortunately, increasingly, one of the better ways to obtain, to boost your profits is to go to the government and ask for a regulation that somehow either enhances your demand or restricts the supply of your competitors. So the problem here is really one of numbers. It's one that economists have understood for quite a while, and it's the problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. The special interests, the businesses that enjoy the benefits of regulation, tend to be relatively few in number. But those who bear the costs of regulation, this is typically consumers, they're very numerous. And as it turns out, the cost of politically organizing is much lower if you only have a few cats to corral than if you have many. So as it turns out in the political process, those few on the left, those on the screen, those who enjoy the benefits of regulation actually are able to wield more weight when it comes to lobbying and successfully maintaining regulations relative to the many who bear the costs of regulation. So what we argue is that this solution, or this problem, while it looks intractable, we could actually look at history and learn a little something from examples when special interests have lost a privilege. And so one of the best examples, and we draw some insight from it, is the successful closure of obsolete military bases. And this is known as the BRAC solution. So for several decades, generals would report to Congress that they actually wanted fewer military bases. Now, if a bureaucracy is actually asking for less spending on itself, that's a pretty good indication that there really might be a problem with overspending in this area. So basically, we had an early 20th century infrastructure, and it wasn't commensurate with the newer strategies. And so they would ask Congress to close the military bases, and over again, Congress would say no. And the reason they would say no is that, much like that dynamic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs with regulation, there was a diffuse cost of these bases. Taxpayers all across the country bore the cost, but the benefit was went to the community that hosted the military base. And so individual members of Congress never wanted to cut spending on the military bases in their district. So in the 1980s and 90s, there was a bipartisan solution called the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. And it worked with a number of important characteristics. So there are four elements of reform in particular that I want to highlight. So first of all, what would happen is legislators were able to cast a conspicuous vote for the general interest. That is, they were able to come out and publicly say that they are voting for the BRAC because they want to close or shrink obsolete military bases and save the taxpayer some money. But second, and this is key, it was a separate institution that they instituted that was given, that it had expert and impartial members. They were given the power to decide which specific special interest privileges had to go, which specific bases were to be closed. Now, what was key about that is even legislators were allowed to go before the commission and say, please don't close the base in my district. But the commission, because it was isolated from politics, it could listen to the legislators, take that into account, but still, if the evidence suggested that it was an obsolete base, they could still close it. So third, part of the reason why the BRAC commissions were able to close the bases is because it was difficult for the legislators to countermand the recommendations of the institution. So in order to ignore the BRAC commission's recommendations, legislators had to cast they had to have a joint resolution of both houses of Congress actively countermanding it. And so it took effect automatically without them doing that. And then fourth, the institution's progress toward the end goal was measured and relayed to the public on a regular basis. So again, going back to step one, legislators could again take credit for voting in the general interest. So what the BRAC Commission has is essentially somewhat of an understanding, a sympathetic understanding of the perverse incentives that many policymakers face. You know, they do what they do, not because they're bad people, but because they often face bad incentives. And it flips those incentives on their heads and allows them to take credit for casting votes in the general interest, but give them a little bit of cover as they take away special interest privilege. So what we argue is the success of this BRAC process, which over the course of 3 separate rounds managed to close 350 obsolete bases, could be applied to create a fresh start in terms of regulations that have been eased or suspended to fight COVID. So here's our recommendation. We suggest 5 steps in a Fresh Start initiative. So every legislature and Congress begins by saying that any rules suspended or modified for COVID would remain off of the books. What's nice about that is that by eliminating these rules, 600 plus rules, we have already identified a large set of regulations that don't work and don't serve the public interest. Second, Congress or the state legislature would create an independent commission comprised of experts with no financial interest, that's key, to study these regulations. So economists, antitrust authorities, former legislators would all make good potential candidates for such a commission. Finally, the commission, or number 3, the commission would then study the suspended rules over a period of time, and they would make recommendations on eliminating, reenacting, or modifying the rules. All the recommendations would take effect automatically unless both houses of the Congress or the state legislature and the executive take affirmative action to oppose them. Again, borrowing from that process with BRAC. So what we've seen with COVID is essentially it's laid bare a mass of ineffective regulations that are counterproductive, that stand in the way not only of people fighting COVID, but also of the sort of permissionless innovation and new technologies that are not only make fighting COVID possible, but also make this kind of difficult and new world that we're all living in a little bit more bearable. But the political economy is against us, but we can learn from the past, and it's our contention that the Fresh Start Initiative is a good way to do that. So for more details on this, you can reach out to my colleagues at the outreach team at Mercatus at outreach at mercatus.gmu.edu. I'm also happy to set up briefings or come talk to legislators or anybody in your community that might want to hear more about it. So with that, I'll end my presentation and open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was very good. And it certainly does pose the question as to why we got down this path with all those regulations like you showed. It's unbelievable what we've allowed to occur. But I think it was P.J. O'Rourke, had that talk about the unseen line of people marching around outside, just like you said, the ones that are bearing the costs, but yet the ones making all the noise are getting all the attention.
That's right. And, a lot of regulations, I mentioned that I've spent a better part of a decade studying certificate of need laws. These are rules in healthcare that most people don't even know exist. But those who benefit from them, the special interests that benefit from the protections from competition, they know that they exist and they are very effective at lobbying to maintain them.
And frankly, to the average consumer, even whenever you say the word regulation, they think, well, that's a good thing.
That's right. And so, and the sad truth is, and again, I go back to the 1970s because there was this interesting time when a good number of progressives understood that really was not true, that quite often regulations are not very pro-consumer. Not only do they raise prices, but if they undermine competition, that can undermine quality. So that's why you find, for example, with occupational licensure, there's really not much evidence that it protects consumers at all. The balance of evidence suggests that it actually undermines the quality of services, and it's very clear that it raises prices.
What a lot of have indicated too, when I get that regulation in place, it allows the entrenched people to suddenly slack off and suddenly act less efficient or whatever, because suddenly now I don't need to anymore.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it essentially allows them to ignore consumers and also ignore costs. So we call that, in economics, we call that X inefficiency.
Excellent. Charles, I see you have your hand up.
I do, Jeff, and great presentation, Matt. The BRAC example is a good one. I recall working for a Republican congressman in the early 90s when, were we on the Armed Services Committee? I don't know, but we had a base that was being closed under BRAC, and of course our staff was feverishly coming up with evidence to protect it to no avail. But you're right, he went and testified like a good congressman for his local constituents and was able to say, hey, we tried, but it was gone. One of the 300. Right. So a couple questions. Are you able to sort of classify those 600 regulations that have been suspended? Do they come from a certain area like healthcare more than others? And then maybe you can go a bit more into detail on your expertise among those suspended regulations, I guess particularly, the con laws, the hospital protectionism, why that's so important.
Sure. So, the sheer number of them, I think means that we're going to be busy studying this episode for quite a long time. So my understanding of the types of regulations is not at all scientific, but I would say, kind of glancing through the lists that have been compiled by various organizations, it appears to me something like maybe 2/3 are healthcare related. So these are, in particular, a large number of states have eased occupational licensing and scope of practice rules in healthcare. So, for example, they've made it easier for out-of-state physicians to offer, to come into a state and offer their services without a local license. Or they've offered, it made it easier for providers to offer telehealth services. So in a lot of states, there were requirements that you actually, you can do telehealth, but you can't you have to have a physical nurse sitting right next to the patient while you're communicating with the physician online, which is basically obviates the whole point of doing any telehealth. So a number of states have eased those or gotten rid of those rules, or they've made it easier also for physicians to, a lot of states would say, okay, you can do telehealth, but the physician can't actually diagnose you or prescribe anything after a telehealth visit. So again, that sort of obviates the whole purpose. A lot of those types of rules have been eased or suspended. We'll see how long they last. I also mentioned the few areas that are outside of healthcare are things like easing rules for restaurants, allowing them to do curbside delivery of food, or even home delivery of food or home delivery of alcohol in places where those have been restricted. So a little bit on certificate of need laws. These are rules that are found in about 37 states that basically say if you want to open or expand a healthcare facility, you've got to ask for permission from a regulator to do that. In the process of asking for that permission, the regulator is not going to assess your record or your qualifications or your safety or anything like that. Instead, they're just going to second guess your opinion that your community needs the service. They're pretty controversial in large part because when you go before the regulator, quite often you're going before your competitors. Members of the healthcare community serve on the board, and if they don't, they can come before the regulator and oppose your application. So we've been studying these rules for about 6 or 7 years now, and what we found is they are associated with overwhelmingly associated with a limited access to care. So states that have these rules, patients will find that there are 30% fewer hospitals, there are 30% fewer rural hospitals, there are 15% fewer ambulatory surgery centers, there are fewer rural ambulatory surgery centers, there's fewer hospital beds, hospice care facilities, dialysis clinics, patients have to drive longer distances to obtain care, they're more likely to leave the state or the county in search of care. And there's even a greater racial disparity in the provision of care between African Americans and other communities in con states relative to non-con states. The laws are also associated with lower quality and higher cost. So basically across the gamut, they are not associated with anything that anyone says we should have more of in healthcare. So during COVID, about 22 states have eased their con laws. We have yet to see if that's going to have a big effect on providers' ability to offer care needed during the crisis. And we've yet to see if these easings or suspension of con laws is going to have any kind of long-term effect, but we'll see.
Interesting.
One quick follow-up on that.
Sure, go right ahead.
It just occurred to me, Jeff, Matt, for an entrepreneur to start up a hospital or ambulatory center, they probably want some better assurance that this con suspension is going to be permanent or longer lived before they put so many millions into building an institution. Do you think that might be the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's also probably too little too late for many of these folks because, for example, you know, a big problem with COVID is just making sure that you have enough hospital beds. Well, I think it's around 20 states regulate hospital beds through con, and many of them have suspended that. But that, you know, takes a while to procure a bed, and so it may not have enough of an effect. We actually did some recent research looking at projected shortages in ICU beds and found that they're, lo and behold, statistically significantly associated with states that have con laws. Con states were twice as likely to experience bed shortages relative to non-con states.
Is anybody kind of exposing that bit of information? That's a very important comparative that you're able to pose.
Yeah, we've had some success in trying to get that message out. We had a piece that ran in the Chicago Tribune and in newspapers all across the country making that point. And I think in response to we've been talking with policymakers really anywhere we could, anybody who will listen, and we have seen them move the dial on that and at least suspend the rules for now. We'll see if it sticks.
It sounds good only because typically it seems like we're trying to defend like an undefendable position oftentimes, and here you've got some good clinical proof. That's quite nice.
Yeah.
Kishore, I see you had your hand up.
You know, I think it's possible to classify different types of dysfunctionality associated with these regulations. I think you mentioned two, and I want to ask you about the third one. So you mentioned con laws, which are obviously special interest driven, absurd, and with greater awareness perhaps can be removed. Then you have the military base type that you mentioned, in which some communities benefit, but overall it's dysfunctional. But the ones that I worry about the most are the holy cows. So for example, Medicare or Medicaid expansion. And I looked at some numbers. The ICU shortages were greater in states which have Medicare expansion. So there is a big challenge because it seems to be associated with belief systems, and it's harder to draw the connection between the regulation and the enormous damage it does. I mean, Medicare perhaps on its own is responsible for much of the high costs because of the underpayments and consolidation and all that. So what are your thoughts on dealing with that kind of dysfunctionality of regulations?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my sense is that we have a unique opportunity right now to deal with a certain set of regulations. You know, if I had my way, Fresh Start initiatives would apply to all regulations on the books. But I also don't think, you know, that is as likely to be successful, frankly, as a more targeted approach that says these are the specific regulations that have been suspended in order to fight COVID, and two, they are particularly intractable and difficult to get rid of because they have this special interest dynamic where special interest benefit from them and large groups lose from them. So this is an opportunity here. I think if the Fresh Start initiative got going in several states and we saw some success, I think it could be replicated to other types of regulations and other types of public policies as well.
Very interesting. Charles, I see you got your hand again.
Actually, I'd like to put on the spot Senator Ebke and Dr. Singleton to talk about the possible permanence of the licensing suspension. Because I know at the Nebraska Platt Institute, Laura has done some licensing liberalization work and indeed presented on this webinar on that. And Dr. Singleton at the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons has been all over, the problem of licensing. Would any of the two of them like to talk about the potential of kind of getting rid of medical licensing on a permanent basis?
Laura, I see you queued yourself up.
Oh, yeah. Let me just say this. I think medical licensing is probably going to be slow to go away. That'll be one of the last ones. I suspect Matt would agree with me on that. But I think that there are plenty of sort of the ancillary medical ones that we need to be paying attention to, surge techs and things like that, some of the nurses' aides. Those were all things that that here in Nebraska and elsewhere were part of this kind of blanket universal recognition. And so I think that those would be my targets to start with. I'm not sure that we're going to get rid of licenses for doctors or nurses, primary providers, and that sort of thing.
Dr. Singleton, what's your kind of take from the doctor's side of things?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I was cutting and pasting something. Hopefully it will pop in the chat. No, it's not going to come out. Shoot. There was just on August 4th an article. Oh, that's the title, but whatever the rest of it, the link and all didn't come out, but you can look it up. It's from the Cato Institute, Healthcare Workforce Reform, COVID-19 Spotlights Need for Changes to Clinician Licensing. How about that? And interestingly, this is suggesting private entities doing the certification. And we have these webinars at AAPS, and I think it's going to be on August 20th. We're having one of the authors come and discuss this whole concept. And I do think that the old idea of competence will win out, that if you didn't have licenses and whatnot, maybe that would occur, maybe it wouldn't. So I do think people would be hesitant to get rid of licensing altogether. But I think it's an interesting concept to get the government out of licensing. And if we could ensure that the people, these private entities, this is going to be tough to ensure, don't have other conflicts of interest, which has always become the huge problem, pharmacy conflict of interest, hospital conflict of interest, whatever. But if somehow we could assure that, then yeah, it should be up there. It's August 4th, Jeff. Then I think it would be a great idea. And interestingly, I think it's because of COVID that just recently in California, we became, now up to about 20 states to have expanded the scope of practice of nurse practitioners. And this, of course, is a contentious issue with regard to the differences in training and how some nurse practitioners hold themselves out to be equal to doctors, et cetera. So there's both sides to this. And one of the real problems is one of the reasons they wanted to expand the scope of practice of nurse practitioners was because it was to help the rural folks out. And then it turns out the nurse practitioners stay in the city just like everybody else, that there's still nobody to go out in the country and take care of people. So what do you do about that? We're a free country. You've gotten this increased scope of practice or decreased licensing. And then you don't go out to improve the lives of those who, that was the reason that they changed the rules. So there certainly are problems with all this, and I think they'll take a while to work out.
What are your thoughts for a minute on that rural situation? Do you suddenly go down the food chain a little bit and let the next person beneath that structure suddenly have more autonomy to be able to grow into fulfilling that niche out there?
Well, one of the things that they're doing now, but it's only in Missouri thus far, is allowing medical students who have graduated but have not yet matched into a residency to act as a medical student physician assistant, where it's kind of a step up from being a physician assistant, but it gives the medical student a chance to do clinical work. And that's being done out in the country with the supervision of a practicing physician.
That sounds
And
like
it
a
seems
great
to be
idea.
successful. And
Well, I
they're
can
going
see-
to try it in Arizona,
I
apparently.
could see that because, you know, if you sort of fall in love with that local community, that person might end up sticking around being the main doctor after a while.
Well, that's exactly right. And there's some folks certainly that we know, Rutherford, Molly Rutherford, Tracy Ragland, they have practices in small towns, and some folks who've done that. I had a friend who had medical school paid for because he worked in the Indian Health Service in South Dakota. He ended up, and he was a city boy, ended up falling in love with that South Dakota life and stayed there. So I think you're right, Jeff, that having a person out there, you learn to love the community and find out how really sweet country folk can be.
Well, and plus the fact that I just have talked to so many doctors, and if they really love the idea of practicing, it almost doesn't matter where they go. And in a small community, it's more like they get to be like the old country doc, and everyone in town knows you. And it's just such a fun, it must make them feel so warm and fuzzy inside, other than like standing inside some corporate clinic hospital, you know, just punching the clock and getting your paycheck at the end of the day. So I can see that. Charles, I see you popped your hand up again.
Well, again, putting some of our fantastic guests on the spot.
Oh, please do.
Abigail Nobel is a nurse and lobbyist on state health issues in Michigan. And I wonder if the idea of deregulation for COVID has come up in that state with that controversial governor and making some of those deregulations permanent, or if there's any other issues that her group is going to push in Michigan.
Hi,
If she wants.
good question. As a matter of fact, it has. And I really liked Laura Ebke's comment about licensure. It makes sense to me that the sort of the LIFO order of things, last in, first out. A lot of people are not even aware that in Michigan, pharmacy techs, the people that run the cash register and count pills, have had to be licensed. And that was because one or two abused the access to opiates back about 3 years ago. They got that pushed through with very little public notice. It's as far as the COVID thing goes, Michigan's governor has already reinstituted the full licensure rules that she had set back for the purpose of COVID efficiency. Our state free market policy organization has put out a couple articles on that, Mackinac Center, and with the social media presence of my nonprofit, Michigan Healthcare Freedom, we've helped expose that. And of course, our governor is one of the least popular nationwide because of her strict COVID restrictions. So yeah, it's a political year, and as a nonprofit and health policy free market advocate in Michigan, we just feel that the long-term changes are not those that take advantage of the political waves as much as the practical ones. And that's why I really appreciate Matt's work, as well as the organization that he works with. We've really highlighted the economic practicalities of getting rid of some of our regulation layers. We've had generations of this now in Washington and at the state levels. So I just really love the work that you guys do. I appreciate you featuring this speaker.
Fantastic. Charles, you want to kind of add to what she just said there?
Well, the question just popped in my mind for Matt. You know, BRAC has been done. Politicians love easy work. If you give them something that's worked before, makes it easy on them, maybe they'll bite. You guys don't lobby, but you know, the smart staffers look at what you guys do. When I was at Cato, they kind of looked at what we did. Have you gotten any bites from the political class there on the Capitol Hill to try this out?
Yeah, it does sound like there's some interest. It's probably much more of a possibility at the state level than at the congressional level. And we've only kind of just gotten this started, but already it looks like there may be some promising states, or at least interested legislators that are interested in bringing it forward. So we've been briefing people in Virginia and in Arizona. And I know my colleagues have been busy briefing people in a few other states that I don't know off the top of my head, but you know, time will tell. One other thing I guess I might point out is you never know when opportunities are going to open up. You know, you guys were just talking about Michigan. At the end of last year, Michigan's Certificate of Need Board did something that no Certificate of Need Board has ever done before, and they sort of set themselves up. Sort of took on the role of the FDA, and they decided that they wanted to limit the expansion of CAR T therapy, which is an experimental cancer therapy that is showing quite a bit of promise. At this point, it's only something that the FDA is allowed to have happen for access to it for patients who are basically tried every other solution and nothing's working. And so this is sort of their last chance. And they moved to limit it. And it was a pretty boneheaded move on their part, because the resistance was quite vocal and said, you know, this is exciting, very needed therapy for some of the most desperate patients, and you're really going to try to limit it. And so they got smacked down by the state legislature. They invoked essentially a completely unused power at that point, where the state legislature, if both houses of the legislature could form majorities to push down a regulation, they were able to do that. And so they got smacked down. And in response, actually, we've seen good con reform bills advance in the legislature. So it's possible that overreach by the con board may be opening a window for reform that wasn't open before.
Usually that's the case, is it not? Whenever anybody overreaches, that's your opportunity to kind of present the sane person in the room. Because you have to think, you know, if we're looking at that, what you just said, for all of our purposes that are in a healthy space, here's this person at death's door willing to try something which all of us will benefit from, because either they get healthy or they don't. We know it failed. But they were going to kind of ideally die anyway. Why would we want to prevent them from being the volunteer to determine if this is safe or dangerous? Makes zero sense. And so you're very true. Charles, I see you had a comment back on that.
We have yet another person who's a muckraker.
Uh-oh, here we go.
His paper in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. John DiLiberto, are you available to unmute yourself and take a guess what Pennsylvania is up to? Much like Michigan, you guys have a very autocratic governor there in Wolf, who has really pissed off the rural Maine sections of your state. Do you have any updates for that state? You want to unmute yourself, John?
It's looking questionable. I'm seeing a chat that says negative. So either he refuses to comment or he's having technical difficulties. Although, here, why don't we put Jonathan on the spot? He's in here. He's a past guest on their show. What's kind of your take on what we're up to today, John?
Deregulation is a good thing. Everything he says speaks volumes. So I'm looking at it from the banking regulation stuff. I mean, we've had close to zero improvements as far as efficiency goes since the 30s. You know, all the banking regulation really got put in there, and then again in the 50s. So I'm happy.
Nobody seems to be who's going to be the cheerleader for regulation today. We need one person to stand up and be the punching bag for today. All right. Well, that's really good. I'll tell you, that was some great information. What we're going to want to do, because we're really kind of coming to the close anyway, so the timing is quite good. I would ask you, though, Matt, is there any kind of last little thing you'd like to wrap this up with as a kind of a closing comment, either what we can do personally or what's going to happen? And here, just kind of throw a twist in it. What's going to happen because of the upcoming election? Is that going to make a difference one way or the other?
Well, it's somewhat naive, perhaps, but I mentioned in my presentation the role that progressives played, and I would say that if we're going to have successful deregulation, it probably needs to be bipartisan. I would remind people that it was really Jimmy Carter, not Ronald Reagan, who got federal deregulation going. He did the most significant deregulations in the last 50 years with the elimination of the Civil Aeronautics Board, deregulation of trucking, deregulation of railroads, freight railroads, not passenger railroads, and even some deregulation that allowed the proliferation of craft brewing, and a lot of us benefit from that. So and I think some of the reason why that was possible, again, is sort of that moment opened, is because of other things that didn't really have to do with regulation, but at the time monetary policy was totally off the rails, and we were dealing with double-digit inflation for 14 years. And so everybody was keenly interested in any kind of a change that might somehow stop skyrocketing prices. And so economically speaking, like I said, the problem was really monetary policy was why inflation was ravaging the economy. But people turned to deregulation as a potential solution, and it ended up working in a lot of ways. And it happened in large part because progressives like Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter got behind it. So I would be on the lookout for not only strange openings, new opportunities, but also for strange bedfellows to potentially partner with and find a way to deregulate, lower prices, higher quality, and better services for all.
No, that's a good way to close it, because really, without finding that strange bedfellow, usually you don't get to the finish line.
Yeah.
You need that last little, why everybody's trying to get the independent voter. You need that littlest bit that's going to flick you over. Real quick, before we dart out, I just had the luxury of being able to find that article we were referring to. So this is it right here. You'll certainly want to get a chance to check this out. This is matching up with what we've been discussing today. So there's a lot of like minds out there, and our goal here is to try to get all of them kind of seen together by the audience, so we realize that there's magnitude to what's being said as opposed to these lone voices chiming in the woods. So again, Matt, thanks so much for today.
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity.